don't follow the ideas of man. They have these arguments that are false. They think it's real smart. It's falsely called knowledge. And then we covered the first two main areas of evidence in regard to creation and evolution. The first was the idea of chance. No intelligence, just chance, complete chance, everything. And then mutations, that all of these improvements in evolution happened through mutations. And then we're on the age of the earth now, and I want to get through that quickly and then cover the fossil record. And as I've said before, we could easily spend weeks on any one of those, but we're going to go through it. And so last week we talked about how even evolutionists say time is the hero. Time is it. I mean, given enough time, anything can happen. Anything's possible. The impossible becomes possible. The possible becomes probable. The probable becomes a virtual certainty. That's the evolutionist idea of things. And so we talked about that and how the odds of it are just so high that they won't even set odds for even something like a feather happening. And so how old is the earth? Well, many evolutionists admit that there is absolutely no evidence, no hard evidence that the earth is billions of years old, but they keep saying that it is. And in fact, there are numerous, I threw up a couple, but a bunch of quotes could be given with evolutionists saying, there's not really any evidence that the earth is billions of years old. And so evolutionists think, though, they continue to think that it was formed billions of years ago. Now, how do they determine that? How do they use the fossils to determine the age? Well, it has to do with the rocks and the ground and things like that. And we talked about that, and there's really, again, no evidence that the earth is billions of years old. The reason most often given is to prove that it's billions of years old is this carbon dating. And so what is carbon dating? Well, it's basically materials breaking down and becoming something different. And in simple terms, it is wood either rotting or becoming petrified. That's the process. And so they measure that, and they measure the amount of the change that has happened within whatever organism that it is. The most well-known method is carbon-14. And interestingly enough, that's the one that gives the closest dates that would agree with the Bible. But there are major assumptions within carbon dating. First of all, they assume the starting amount of material that was in the thing. Secondly, the breakdown of radioactive material, they assume, has always happened at the same rate, in spite of the fact that we know that it doesn't. None of the lead or the uranium that's left in the rock has been added to the rock. So they make all these assumptions. We talked about Mount St. Helens and how those rocks formed. I gave several illustrations of this and how you have to assume. You don't know when the beginning was, and so you have to assume all these things. And so gave some dictionary definitions of some of those things. Carbon dating is only accurate back, they say, to 30, 40,000 years, maybe 50 at the most. The man who started it, if you take his presumptions at the beginning, and they turned out to be not really correct, what you really come up with after all this time, and he sort of invented carbon dating in 1946, then you come up with the Earth a pretty recent age. Well, what was the original amount of carbon in the atmosphere? Nobody knows, and there's not any way you can know. It's like trying to figure out how long a candle's been burning when you don't know the rate that it burns, and you don't know how big it was when it started burning. And so it gave several illustrations of that, and all of the assumptions that have to be made when we're talking about carbon dating. And so we got about to that point last week. And we showed that, well, let me go back for just a second. We showed that it's a matter of fact, observable fact, that the rate of breakdown of these things can be affected in a number of ways by a number of different things. Anywhere from, gamma rays and things like that to electricity and all kinds of things changes the rate of the breakdown of these things. Now, what would happen if a dinosaur bone was carbon dated? Well, at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, scientists dated dinosaur bones using carbon dating. The age came back a few thousand years old. Well, that didn't fit their preconceived ideas of that dinosaurs lived a million years ago. So what did they do? Well, they just threw out the results. They date the bone. It says it's several thousand years old, and they say, no, that's not the answer we wanted. They throw it out because they assume that it was millions or billions of years ago. That's not science. It's just not science. So you have unbiased science changing the facts to support the theory. True science doesn't do that. True science does not change the facts to fit the theory. You come up with a theory, you look at the facts. If the facts don't match your theory, you don't stick with your theory and change the facts. You change your theory to match the facts. In August 10, 1990, 30 years ago, a dinosaur bone was sent to the University of Arizona to be carbon dated. The Allosaurus dinosaur was supposed to be around 140 million years, according to these geniuses. The sample of bones were blind samples. Okay, so they take this dinosaur bone, they send it to these geniuses at the University of Arizona. They didn't tell them it was a dinosaur bone. So, how old is this bone? They send it to them. How old is this bone? The results, it was carbon dated somewhere around 16,000 years old. Now, I think that was even a little bit long, but it's certainly not millions and certainly not billions and billions of years old. The potassium argon dating, which was the method they've used in a number of different things, and it was used to date volcanic materials. Scientists got dates of 164 million and 3 billion years for 2 Hawaiian lava flows. But these lava flows happened about 200 years ago. So they know that the rock formed about 200 years ago. When they tested them, they got a date of 164 million and 3 billion, in that area, 164 to 3 billion. Now, you're not going to see this material in any of your kids' science books. It's not in there. Mount St. Helens, just back that for a minute, it blew its top in 1980. When it exploded, the top 1,300 feet of the mountain blew off, and it no longer existed. In the years that followed, there were actually 5 different sort of bubbles that formed, or domes, and then a 6th one formed, and that's the one they say that you can still see there today. So we know it was very young. The rock from that dome that formed, we know it was very young. I mean, people watched it form, okay? And so they use the potassium argon dating method, so they assume it decays at the same rate. They measured how much potassium and how much argon is in the rock. But of course, they don't pay any attention to all the objections of creationists with some of these methods. And so, if this method was accurate in dating rocks, the rocks at Mount St. Helens there would be very young. At the time, we know for a fact that the rocks they were examining were about 10, 15 years old since they had formed. But guess what age their highly accurate system came up with? The rock was 350,000 years old, and the minerals in the rock was 2.4 million years old. The assumptions they make are clearly, provably not safe, accurate, or trustworthy. I mean, you observe a rock forming, and then they say it's millions of years old. The Cardenas basalt is one of the deeper layers of the eastern end of the Grand Canyon, and those rocks are formed from a lava flow. As you go to the western end of the Grand Canyon, there are some volcanoes on the rim. Those lava flows go right over the rim of the canyon and flow down to the river. Now, if you do the potassium argon dating method on those lava flows that happen on the rim, you get a date that's fairly young, less than 1 million years old. Biblically, that's too high anyway, but nevertheless, you get it less than 1 million years old. When they use the same method to date the basalt rock there, the date doesn't come out quite right. So, what they do is they throw the dating method out and use another dating method to get the date they want. Therefore, on some rocks, they use a method of dating, and it's the absolute gospel truth as far as the date, because it gives them the date that they want. But they use the same method on other rocks in the same area, and they don't like the results because it's not what they want. So rather than say, well, wait a second, maybe our dating methods have some problems. Maybe they're not as trustworthy as we think they are. They just hold on to their fantasy that the dating methods that they're using are correct, and that the date that they came up with correct. Again, brethren, you can call this whatever. You can call it a purple banana if you want, but don't call it science. It has nothing to do with science. It really doesn't. Here are some examples, some other examples of faulty results. Volcanic rocks in the Reunion Islands, 2.2 to 4.5 billion years old by using one method of carbon dating, and another method showed them to be 100,000 to 2 million years old. Now, I mean, this is not serious. How old are those rocks? Well, somewhere between 100,000 and 4.5 billion years old, just in that area somewhere. Moon dirt from the Apollo flights was dated by 4 different methods, and it showed ages ranging from 2.3 to about 18 billion years. One rock on Apollo 16 ranged from 7 to 18 billion years old, but it was chemically treated until it showed an acceptable 5.8 billion. Now, what if somebody said, how old is this church building? And I said, well, it's somewhere between 2.3 and 18 billion years old. Just in that area somewhere. This is childishness. It's ridiculous. It certainly isn't science. How do you know if these dates are accurate? You can't. There's no way you can know. It's silliness. And I'm sorry to be condescending, but this is really childishness that is being put out there. Certain volcanic rocks from Russia were shown to have an age of 50. Shown to have an age of 50 million, again, in that area somewhere, 50 million to 14.6 billion years old, even though they know the things were thousands of years old. In some cases, there are 5 different dating methods on the same rock, and they come up with 5 different dates, millions of years apart. I mean, how's that for accuracy? Materials from a prehistoric village site, which was occupied for 500 years, were shown to have a dating range of about 6,000 years. The shell of living snails and squids have been dated up to 2,300 years. I'm going to say a little bit more on that in a minute. Mortar from a 785-year-old English castle showed the mortar an age of 7,370 years. Samples of coal, oil, natural gas, supposedly millions of years old, which dated at less than 50,000 years old. Some ocean deposits, supposed to be some of the oldest on Earth, were dated at 40,000 years old. Here are some carbon dates that were rejected. They were rejected because they didn't agree with evolution. Okay? Living penguins, carbon dated at 8,000 years old. Shells of living mollusks, they carbon dated their shell 23,000 years old. You're not going to find this in the textbooks. It's easy to find, but you won't find it in the textbooks. Again, we're talking about something that's alive. Somebody threw this, this little mollusk down there has been dated at 2,300 years, 23,000 years old, and he's saying, but I'm alive, What do you mean I'm 23,000 years old? A dead seal, they'd been dead for 30 years, dated at 4,600 years old. A freshly killed seal, they dated one of those too. Freshly killed seal, dated 1,300 years old. One part of the Velocevich mammoth carbon, carbon dated at 29,500 years, and another part of the same animal dated at 44,000 years old. One part of Dima, a baby frozen mammoth, was 40,000 years old. Another part of the same animal dated at 26,000, and the wood immediately around the carcass was 9 to 10,000 years old. Does anybody think it took 14,000 years for this mammoth to slowly die? Because one part of it dated at 40,000, another part at 26. The lower leg of Effie, the Fairbanks Creek woolly mammoth, had a carbon dating of 15,000 years. That's the lower leg. The skin dated at 21,000. I'm not making this up. This may be surprising some of you. I'm not making this up. And this is not science. This is goofiness. And this is not hard to find. It's a matter of public record. Many other specific examples could be given. The point is these methods are not reliable. There have been some that have been 90% or more off. The inconsistencies have been seen in these different types of dating are all over the place to be seen. And the thing is, the longer they continue to do it, this is amazing. They continue to stick with it. And the more they do it, the more evidence piles up against them. But that doesn't matter to them. Now, what evidence is there that the Earth is very young? I'm going to hit on a couple of things, and I've got a handout for this. We've seen, though, that carbon dating is the only thing that even closely indicates the Earth is very old, and it's not reliable. So I want to look at some evidence that indicates the Earth is young. First of all, just a couple things from the Bible. If we believe the Bible, there's some information in the Bible I think we have to consider. When you look at the genealogies in the Bible, there's no way you can come to the idea that man has been on Earth for millions, and certainly not billions of years. According to Luke 3, there are 55 generations from Abraham to Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, from Abraham to Joseph. Archaeologists have established that there were about 2,000 years between Abraham and Jesus. We all know that. Luke also lists 20 names back before that from Adam to Abraham. Okay? Now, it is true in some cases that the Bible doesn't list necessarily every specific person in the genealogies. But if evolution is true, combined with what we know to be true, then if there's 2,000 years and 55 generations of Abraham and Jesus, then we have to believe that in the 20 names given Adam to Abraham, there's more than 3 million years. I mean, either the Bible's true or these clowns are accurate. Scientists have shown that the moon is moving away at a tiny rate, moving away from the Earth. It's perceptible, but it's very minor. But when you're talking about the numbers they're talking about, that allows for a lot of time. And so if you do the math, you can calculate that 85 million years ago, the moon was orbiting the Earth at a distance of about 35 feet. If you do the math, and remember these numbers are humongous. I said before, it's just like the national debt. We throw millions, billions, trillions. It's all whatever that is, whatever that stuff is. That's how we think. I'm going to say it again. This is one of the ways that I remember how big these numbers are. It has been a little over 1 billion minutes since Jesus was on the earth. That's how big a billion is. And so we're talking about huge numbers. When you're talking about 14 billion years, and so somebody does the math, and you do the math, the moon is gradually moving away. Now, in a period of 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 years, it hasn't moved a whole lot. But when you're talking about 85 million years, or when you're talking about billions of years, then it was right on top of us. And one other thing, dirt. One of the things that causes evolutionist problem is dirt. Evolutionists claim, of course, that the Earth's crust and life itself has developed over billions of years. But the nature of dirt really creates a problem for evolutionists. Everybody knows that a lot of the Earth's crust is covered in soil. Soil is dirt that contains material needed to support life and animal life. Now, this is a little bit gross, but it's still valid to think about. Soil is made up of minerals, washed out rocks, and of weathered rock itself that has been broken down into small grains. But alone, the rock material, or dirt, is sterile. Plants can't grow in it, and animals can't live on it. In order to grow things, soil has to contain organic matter. That is material that comes from or is made up of once living things. So soil has to contain elements that come from plants and animals. In fact, The soil has to have a large number of living organisms in it, single-cell bacteria and those kind of things. The encyclopedia, don't take my word for it, the Encyclopedia Britannica says a square foot of rich soil may contain up to 1 billion organisms. These tiny living things help to break down the decaying bodies of the plants and animals that have died. The chemicals in the dead organic matter will be used again to grow the plants and animals that replace the one that died. Also, soil bacteria take nitrogen from rocks and air and release it into the forms that can be used by plants. Now, if we look at the surface of the earth and ask what's necessary to support life, we need soil. Soil has to contain organic material. Soil must have millions of tiny living organisms in it for anything to grow. That's a problem for those who believe in the slow evolution of Earth's surface and of living things. So where did the soil that living things need in order to exist come from before there were living things to fill the soil? The only possible explanation is that the earth and life didn't develop as some scientists think. When God created the world, he must have covered the continents with soil already filled with living creatures that the earth must have in order to support life. So if it can be shown that the earth is thousands or tens of thousands of years old, then the dinosaurs can't possibly be millions of years old if it can be shown that the earth. Now, there's a whole bunch of other, and I'm not gonna go through these because I got a handout for these. There's bunches and bunches and bunches of ways to figure out that the earth is very young, comparatively, when you compare it to what the evolutionists think. And so I'm not going to go through those. There's a bunch of them. There's a couple of ways that I think have problems. But I want to get onto the fossil record because I got to get through this today. Okay, fossils. Darwin wrote in his famous book that he speculated if he was right about his theory, he said, then the fossil record will show it. Specifically, he said this: geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against this theory of evolution. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. In other words, he's saying, right now, we don't have enough of a geological record to prove my theory. But I think maybe we'll find it. If I were to summarize, he says, this is what I think happened. If my theory is true, the record will be perfectly preserved in fossils. Of course, it hasn't happened yet. The fossil record, if it hasn't happened, the fossil record will clearly show that I'm wrong. Right now, the fossil record doesn't show that I'm correct, but I believe that is due to the fact that we haven't really dug up very many fossils, and so we have an incomplete record. So in a nutshell, well, it's been 160 years since he said that. And the fossil record still doesn't show anything. Well, what do fossils tell us? As Christians, we shouldn't be afraid to pursue the truth and to look at the facts of anything. So, according to Darwin himself, the fossil record, he says, is what's going to prove evolution, if it's going to be proven true. And so here are some examples. Fossils appear suddenly and a variety in the earth. That's what we see in the fossil record. Now, evolution would lead us to expect to find, in every case, the simple animals or living things in the deepest part of the earth, and we would expect to find the more complex record higher toward the Earth's crust. And so the fossils, which are the oldest, would be above the ones that are more primitive. That's not the case in every case. In fact, in a lot of cases, it's all jumbled up. Secondly, there's a lot said about the missing link as if there's only one missing link. In reality, there are literally hundreds or thousands, or maybe seriously millions, of missing links, yet not even one has been found. If evolution was going to be proven, Darwin says, we're going to find it in the fossil record. Doesn't it make sense that if that theory were true, that there would be all kinds of examples of that, millions of them probably, of examples of those missing links? And they've been digging it for 160 years since Darwin said that. But there's not been one single fossil uncovered which shows that something was part of one species and part of another. Not one. There is no evidence of a gradual change from invertebrates to vertebrates, fish to amphibians, amphibians to reptiles, reptiles to birds, or reptiles to mammals. It's just simply not there. And again, there should be millions and millions of examples of this. The list of evolutionists who admit this is so long. I mean, we could probably literally spend the entire class period just giving you quotes of evolutionists who admit this. But let me just give you a few. Dr. George Gaylord of Harvard and many others have pointed out it is no longer acceptable to blame the absence of transitional forms on the imperfection of the geological record. Simpson said as early as 1944 that a special explanation was necessary to explain the absence of transitional forms in the fossil records. And he wasn't the only one to say that. One evolutionary scientist who agreed with Simpson was Dr. Richard Goldschmidt. And Goldschmidt rejected the concept of evolution through a slow, gradual process. So you see what they're doing now? Well, maybe it didn't happen slowly, since they can't find any evidence of it. In 1952, Goldschmidt said, nobody has produced a species by the selection of micromutations, slow, gradual. In the best known organisms, innumerable mutants are known. If we were able to combine 1,000 or more such mutants in a single individual, this still would have no resemblance whatsoever to any type known as a species in nature. And so they say we don't find any of those things. 12 years earlier, and you're not going to find any of these quotes in your kid's science book. 12 years earlier, Goldschmidt, in what was considered a classic work, The Material Basis for Evolution, said, it was far past time to admit the true condition of the fossil record and the complete absence of transitional forms. He said the evolutionary paleontologists had dug for 100 years since Darwin and still had no transitional fossils necessary to document their theory. He further suggested that evolutionists, quote, get their act together, so to speak, and come up with a theory that was at least consistent with the fossil record. Now, Stephen Gould was one of the foremost evolutionists, and he predicted that Goldschmidt would be largely vindicated. And when that quote, so he blatantly admits that not one intermediate form has been found. His conclusion is that evolution, this is hilarious, doesn't work gradually. After saying for so long it works gradually, he says, well, it doesn't work gradually. It goes in spurts. Basically, his theory boils down to the idea that one day a lizard laid an egg and a chicken hatched out of it. I mean, that's what he's saying. This makes evolution a theory which it'll always be untestable, and it's therefore unprovable and therefore unscientific. Yet he's saying the fossil record does not prove evolution because evolution happened too fast. So anyway, I was going to say Stephen Gould, one of the most foremost evolutionists, and he had predicted that Goldschmidt would be largely vindicated. When he was quoted that statement above, Gould said, no, Goldschmidt didn't say that. He said, any evolutionist who believes such nonsense will rightly be laughed off the intellectual state. When the quote was given to him, he said, well, he must have meant it to be a metaphor. But it doesn't seem like any of the other evolutionists took it that way. So isn't it incredible then? Hundreds of millions of years of evolution, and evolutionists admit there's not one single transitional form. All the fancy talk, hypothesis theories, and all that cannot offset this one single fact, and it can't account for the gap that we see. So since they have no transitional record of anything, they say, well, it happened too fast. I'm not giving you religious propaganda. This is available for anybody to find. Now, fossil remains. The fossil remains of ancient animals, or supposedly ancient animals, show that those animals are basically the same as the animals are now. An example is the coelacanth. I think it's pronounced the coelacanth fish. It was supposedly extinct for 66 million years. According to these geniuses, the oldest known fossil, coelacanth fossil, was over 410 million years old. Coelacanths were thought to become extinct in the late Cretaceous period, about 66 million years or so ago. But they were rediscovered in 1938. You're not going to see this in the science books. They were rediscovered in 1938 off the coast of South Africa. They found there is virtually no difference between the ones we have today and the ones they find in their fossils that they think are 400 million years old. Now, I got to get to prehistoric man. What about prehistoric man? Well, it's important to remember. I think it's really important to remember. The whole idea of prehistoric man means it was prehistory, and that leaves God out. God gives us the history of man. If you believe the Bible, God gives us the history of man and how he began. The atheists just don't want to accept it. And so the talk of prehistoric man fundamentally leaves God out of the picture and the process. For many years, we were told that the DNA of a human is 98 to 99% the same as an ape. We've now found that the DNA letters of a person, there are at least 600 million letters that are totally different. Out of the 3 billion, at least 20% or so are different. So we're really not even in DNA that much like them. I want to get to some specifics in a minute, but more and more is being learned about the information in the DNA. Our DNA is by itself, as far as I'm concerned, almost a miracle from God. It is amazingly complex. It is an amazingly complex language that is three-dimensional. Somebody compared it to this. They said, if it were a book, you could read it forwards and backwards, side to side, and across the pages. I heard one guy say, suppose you have a book and you read it, and you say, this is a book in English, and it's a novel, okay? It's an adventure novel. You give that book to a friend, and the friend is German, and he's able to read it in German. He says, well, it's written in German, and it's a historical novel. He gives it to a friend from France, and he says it's written in French, but it's a tragic romance, and everybody dies at the end. You give it to a friend who lives in Israel, and he reads Hebrew, and he says, no, I read it in Hebrew, right to left. And so that kind of illustration is what DNA has been compared to. It's an amazingly complex language system, and it comes from the mind of God. No matter what evolutionists may say, information that complex doesn't write itself. It just doesn't. Supposedly, the strongest evidence for evolution is found in the fossil record of these half-man, half-ape, caveman things, which we see in the March of Progress. We've all seen that. And they blindly follow that and blindly hold to it in spite of the fact that it has all kinds of problems. And so I want to talk specifically about some. Neanderthal, supposedly an extinct species of human that was widely distributed in the Ice Age in Europe 120,000 to 35,000 years ago, in that area somewhere. Bones were found in 1856 in a cave near Neander Valley in Germany. They were thought for many years, the Neanderthal, to be cave people. They were portrayed as hunched over, half-dressed, stupid, half-man, half-ape beings. They found a skeleton actually in 1908 that it was modeled after. In 1956, the bones were re-examined, and it was found that they were the bones of normal individuals whose skeletons had been deformed by rickets or arthritis or something like that. You're not going to find it in the textbooks. They finally figured out and had to admit that what they called Neanderthals, they were buried where humans were. They practiced artwork. They had needles and thread. They had musical instruments. And there is even evidence that they worshiped. They did everything that humans did. In fact, they did some things that we still can't do. They had some kind of super glue that they used in a way that we don't even know how they did it. We can't duplicate it. Because they were intelligent and people who could think and create. They walked upright. In actuality, this Neanderthal, what they did was they dug up an old human cemetery. Now, Cro-Magnon man The name scientists once used to refer to what's now the early modern humans, or anatomically modern humans, people who lived in a world at the end of the last ice age, 40 to 10,000 years ago. A century and a half of research since has led scholars to change their minds. Shazam. The new belief is that the physical dimensions of the so-called Cro-Magnon are not sufficiently different enough from modern humans to warrant a separate designation. The image of Cro-Magnon man has changed a lot in the last 100 years. Scientists have argued among themselves over what to do. Was he a true man? Was he an ape? Did he evolve from Neanderthals? Did he evolve into Homo sapiens? And the truth is, the so-called Cro-Magnon man is just like me or you. He's not an evolutionary ancestor. He's just as human as we are. There are drawings attributed to Cro-Magnon, and they show all kinds of animals and the people wearing furs and had tools. The Cro-Magnon man remains qualified for a true human status based on the physical morphology, their brain size, and their culture. The skeletons erroneously labeled Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon are fully human. It's very possible that they were descendants of Noah. Heidelberg man, probably some of you have heard of Heidelberg man. This was supposed to be an ape man. The biology books also picture this one as totally reconstructed. Heidelberg man, named Homo heidelbergensis, discovered near Heidelberg in Germany in 1907 by Daniel Hartmann. Nothing conclusively points to the idea that he was an ape man. There's an indication that he was possibly just a man. Now, are you wondering why I have a jawbone up there? The reason I have a jawbone up there is that Heidelberg man was based on a singular jawbone. Now you see these drawings, and even if you go in certain museums, it's an entire man. Oh, here's Heidelberg man. See him? He's right here, and he's doing whatever. They reconstructed that entire body from a jawbone, is what they did. They're dishonest people. Piltdown man. Piltdown man was discovered in a gravel pit by Charles Dawson in 1912. He was a lawyer and kind of an amateur archaeologist. Charles Dawson claimed that he had discovered the missing link between ape and man. He had found part of the human-like skull in some gravel beds in England. Dawson and Smith Woodward started working together, making further discoveries in the area. They found a set of teeth, a jawbone, some more skull fragments, and primitive tools which they suggested belonged to the same individual. Smith Woodward made a reconstruction of the skull fragments, and the archaeologists hypothesized that it indicated evidence of a human ancestor living 500,000 years ago. They announced that in 1912. And so from these few skull fragments and teeth and a jawbone, they put together a drawing of an entire body of a person or an ape they called Piltdown man. And by looking at it, people would conclude that they had dug up again an entire skeleton, or nearly an entire skeleton, but it was only a few bones. Now, the Piltdown skull was locked away inside a vault for many years, and people were not given permission to study, almost never. And by the way, that's true of most of these things. Instead of really seeing, in most cases, even when you see them, you see they're not really the true bones. They're a plaster cast, of course. The truth is that many museums don't even have the true fossils on display. They're replicas. But people believed this so much that they even erected a memorial stone where these liars found it. And so, to make a long story short, it was found once people had the chance to begin to actually investigate and examine it. It was found and proven to be a complete hoax and a fraud. In fact, if you look it up on the internet, it is described in I think most of the ones that I looked at. It's not even described as the Piltdown man. It's referred to as the Piltdown hoax. Let's see. Most of the time, the world's most respected paleontologists and anthropologists are not even allowed to view some of this, and that's why most of them are fraud. The cranium itself was broken up, but it clearly belongs to a human. The jawbones were not human. Where'd the jaw come from? According to Martin Lobenow, the jaw belonged to a female orangutan. If you compare that jaw to the jaw of a female orangutan, they're almost identical. Many museums and books don't want you to know this. They want you to believe the evidence of evolution is solid, and they don't want you to know the amount of manipulation and fraud and outright lies there are there. Let me see, I'm already running out of time. There were once they discovered there were also scratch marks on the teeth and things like that. Richard Leakey said the Piltdown forgery, he's an evolutionist, he even calls it, the Piltdown forgery illustrates the sometimes indecent eagerness with which scientists will accept what they want to believe. Researchers today are not exempt from this weakness. Well, if they were scientists, they would do better than they're doing. He says they were so eager to believe what they wanted to believe. And I said, well, maybe the experts didn't want to see what was there. Maybe they're so committed to the worship at the altar of Charles Darwin that they're blind to God's eternal truth. At least that's my theory. But Piltdown Man was one of the greatest evidences for years of evolution, and it's a lie. And I wonder how many of our children in schools have been fed this lie and believe it. A few other famous findings. I was just going to say, there's no way a person who believes in God and the Bible is going to believe this garbage. A few other ones. Peking man was found in China. The models were exported. The bones came up missing during World War II. Lots of conflicting reports came out. Finally, it was determined that Peking man was a big monkey or a chimp. 2 human skulls were found in the same place. It was later determined it was probably actually an animal that was eaten by 2 men. At the end of World War II, the bones were supposedly shipped to America. They never arrived, and they haven't been seen since. Java man, biology books usually have this totally reconstructed like all the others. This was found in 1890 by a doctor, Dutch army doctor. It's also called Homo Erectus. The way that it presented, we'd think they found the entire skeleton. In reality, what they found was a small piece of skull bone, a lower jaw, and 3 teeth and a thigh bone that was 50 feet from the rest of the bones that they found. There was a lot of debate about this for years. Finally, in 1956, Du Bois concluded that was actually an ape of some kind, and there's a picture of the bones. Another one, Ors, I think it's Ors, is a town in Spain. It's probably Orsay or something. And it was found in 1982, 40 years ago. It was hailed as the oldest fossilized human remains ever. Well, there was a lot of controversy about that. There was a lot of people who were wondering. 1 year later, officials admitted the skull fragments was not human, but came from a 4 to 6 month old donkey. Nebraska man, these are drawings of Nebraska man. These are about the only drawings that exist, and that's for a good reason. The tooth was discovered in some deposits which were allegedly 6 million years old. This one was not constructed from hundreds of bones or dozens of bones, not even one entire bone. The entire body was constructed from part of a tooth. The single tooth was upheld as one of the best pieces of evidence for evolution. Christianity itself was on trial in the Scopes monkey trial, remember? Many Christians compromised what the Bible said, and evolution was allowed to enter the classroom. This thing was used as evidence in the Scopes monkey trial. It was part of a tooth, but not just any tooth. The tooth, well, okay, here's, trying to figure out what to skip here. Let me just do this. The tooth, which they reconstructed this entire man from, the reconstruction based on part of a single tooth, but it wasn't even a human tooth. It was a pig's tooth. And so they take a chip from a pig's tooth and present it in the Scopes monkey trial as evidence, which was a major trial that changed, just a lot of stuff. And so here's what it is. Well, here's a bone. And so they think, oh, remember the March of Progress. Well, I found a prehistoric bone. And so we've seen that they're hoaxes. Virtually all of them are hoaxes. In fact, I don't know of one that's not. There are two important contradictions. I'm going to skip that. Because I want to just talk quickly about a couple of other things. There are other supposed proofs of evolution. Embryology is the view that that each embryo during its development form a single cell to a mature fetus. And their silly theory is it goes through the stages which correspond one after the other to each step of evolution in the species. Maybe some of you have heard that. According to this, man has evolved from a single cell in a primitive ocean into an invertebrate, then to a fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, and then to human eventually. First, it's admitted by evolution that there are stages of embryo which do not resemble any possible ancient forms. There are many examples of this which are discussed in different books. Second, it's admitted by evolutionists that a big majority of stages of embryo which should resemble ancient ancestors are totally absent from the development. There are really only 3 supposed stages present. And so that is a theory that has been put out there, but it's about as goofy as the others. Comparative anatomy is supposedly another proof. This is based on looking at the structure of different animals and how they're similar. For example, a man's arm, a horse's leg, a bat's wing are similar in shape. And so they say, see, this is evidence of evolutionists. Now, we don't deny that. We as Christians and creationists, we don't deny that there's similarity. Why should we deny it? But even here, what I would say is that it's evidence of a creator. All cars, from the very first ones to the modern ones, are very similar. They all have a starter. They all have wheels and tires. They have an engine. They have a steering wheel. Some have larger engines. Some have more wheels than others, but it doesn't mean that all cars evolved from an original car. It means that they had a designer and that they used similar things. You could say the same thing about buildings. All buildings have similar kinds of things. If God had wanted to, he could have made people with 6 arms, but they'd still be arms. He could have made elephants, since they're so heavy, with 8 legs. He could have made dogs with 2 heads if he'd wanted to, or with 10 ears. But he didn't. So yeah, there's similarity in structure, but so what? A couple of other quick things. Vestigial organs, and this means things like your appendix. You know, they say, these are left over from times when previous animals needed them and we don't need them anymore. Well, they're finding out more and more that we needed some of those things. J.A. Kirk has listed in Implications of Evolution what he says are the 7 basic assumptions that they make. He says that many evolutionists ignore the 6th and only consider the last. Non-living things gave life to living material. That spontaneous generation occurred. And it only occurred once, because nobody's ever observed it since. Viruses, bacteria, plants, and animals are all interrelated. Protozoa gave rise to metazoa. Various invertebrates phyla are interrelated. Invertebrates gave rise to vertebrates, and within vertebrates, fish gave rise to amphibians, amphibians reptiles, reptiles birds, and birds to mammals. We've said before, but I'll say again, there's been several very interesting admissions over the years by evolutionists, and we're pretty much out of time, so I'm not going to go through all those. But it's just more admissions from evolutionists that we don't have any evidence for this stuff. The president of one of the societies, this was kind of a funny one, he's talking about lungfish. He says, I've often thought how little I should like to have to prove organic evolution in a court of law. Spontaneous generation has been dismissed as a possibility by almost all scientists now. All admit that it can't happen, it doesn't happen, it's never been observed to happen, it won't happen, but of course it did. The idea of inherited characteristics has been proven false as well. Evolutionists do not use the scientific terminology much of the time. You read this and it's, let's assume, let's suppose, if you accept this or that. And so the picture comes to mind of a bunch of blind men with blindfolds on, groping in the middle of a huge cave in the middle of the night, looking for a black cat, which isn't there and doesn't make any sounds. And yet they've talked about it for so long that they still say there's a cat there. Another guy Mencken said, a philosopher is a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there. A theologian is the man who finds the cat. So, just a couple of last things. I'm not going to be here next week, but the 2 weeks after that, we're going to talk about dinosaurs, okay? People believe in evolution for any number of reasons, and in a book called The Truth, God, or Evolution, they list several reasons why people believe. And the biggest, maybe the biggest one, is that all these lies. There seems to be no proof of God. That's what kids are taught in school. And there seems to be proof of evolution, and both of them are a lie. Job said, in truth, I know that this is so, but how can a man be in the right before God? If one wishes to dispute with him, he could not answer him once in 1,000 times. And then he says, God, who does great things unfathomable and wondrous works without number. And I take that to mean that, among other things, God has not only done wondrous things, but he has done wondrous and amazing things that people have not discovered yet. And I think we probably will. Well, I got through it. But I just want to say again, I mean, we could have spent 4 or 5 months just on this or more, because I didn't come close to getting anywhere near, probably not even a quarter of the material that is available on this. So thank you for your patience and time. I hope that's a blessing to you. Most of this stuff is pretty easy to find. You have to dig for some of it, but most of it's relatively easy to find. But your kids are not going to have it in their science books. So I'll be gone next week. I'm going to be out of town. The following 2 weeks, I'm going to cover dinosaurs, so I hope you can be here for that. There's all kinds of dinosaurs in the Bible.